Stop scrolling for a moment. Before another voice tells you what to fear, desire, buy, believe, or become, ask yourself a harder question. What if the deepest reason you feel powerless is not that you lack power, but that you have been trained to hand it away? You hand attention to whoever interrupts you first. You hand interpretation to the loudest opinion in the room. You hand imagination to fear and allow it to rehearse disasters that have not happened. You hand choice to urgency, courage to the demand for certainty, and discipline to whatever mood happens to arrive. You hand meaning to circumstances, worth to approval, and tomorrow to whatever happened yesterday. By the end of the day, you feel exhausted. You say life has taken your power. But much of that power was not taken. It was outsourced through small agreements you barely noticed making. This is how a person can be intelligent and still feel directed by anxiety, can possess information and still be unable to decide, can understand a teaching at night and abandon it the next morning. Knowledge is present. Authority is absent. The modern world did not invent this problem, but it has made the surrender nearly continuous. The marketplace enters the bedroom. Other people's emergencies reach your hand before your own mind has fully awakened. Comparison waits beside the bed. Noise arrives before intention. You now have access to more voices than any generation before you. Yet your own deeper voice can become difficult to hear. You can contact almost anyone immediately, yet struggle to remain in contact with the part of you that knows what matters. This work is about recovering that contact, not through supernatural claims, not through the fantasy that thought controls every event, not through forced positivity, emotional performance, or withdrawal from the world. The powers we will examine are ordinary enough to be overlooked and strong enough to redirect a life. Attention, interpretation, imagination, pause, courage, discipline, meaning, renewal, and service. Each is already active within you. The question is not whether you possess them. The question is who or what is currently using them. Fear uses attention by making danger impossible to ignore. Resentment uses interpretation by turning a new event into evidence for an old wound. Anxiety uses imagination by creating futures that feel real enough to obey. Impulse destroys pause by insisting that discomfort must be solved immediately. Approval weakens courage by making action dependent upon permission. Mood borrows discipline by allowing work only when enthusiasm appears. Pain captures meaning by claiming that what happened explains everything you are. The past resists renewal by insisting that the old identity is the only identity available. Ego distorts service by converting contribution into a demand for recognition. None of these powers disappears when used unconsciously. They remain powerful. They simply begin building a life you did not deliberately choose. Before we continue, perform a quiet inventory. Do not ask where you are weak. Ask where you have surrendered authorship. Where does another person's opinion determine your emotional weather? Where does fear decide what you will not attempt? Where does urgency spend money, send messages, make promises, or end relationships before wisdom arrives? Where does the need to be understood keep you arguing inside a court that never closes? Where does the past continue voting on a future it will never have to live? Choose one area, not your entire life. One area in which you know your inner authority has become divided. Perhaps it concerns work, money, the body, a relationship you keep reopening, or the second half of life and the fear that too much time has passed. Hold that area in mind. Every power that follows will return to it, because a teaching becomes valuable only when it enters a real decision. The promise of this journey is specific. Before it is over, you will understand how attention becomes life, how interpretation becomes emotional reality, how imagination becomes rehearsal, how a pause becomes freedom, how courage can move without certainty, how discipline survives motivation, how meaning can be created without glorifying suffering, how renewal becomes possible without erasing the past, and how service turns private power into a life that matters beyond itself. You will also build a brief daily practice for calling these powers back when fear, urgency, distraction, or approval begin governing again. And you will see why the powers fail when separated. Imagination without discipline becomes fantasy. Discipline without meaning becomes punishment. Courage without pause becomes recklessness. Service without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Attention without direction becomes obsession. Together, these powers form an inner government. When they cooperate, a person becomes more difficult to manipulate, distract, and separate from what they know is true. Not because they become rigid, because they become rooted. A rooted person can listen without surrendering judgment, can change without losing identity, can admit error without collapsing into shame, can feel fear without granting fear the final signature, can endure uncertainty without manufacturing a false answer merely to escape not knowing. This is inner authority. But before recovering real power, you must learn to recognize the forms that imitate it. The counterfeit kingdom, the forms of power that leave you weaker. Counterfeit power is attractive because it produces immediate sensation. It feels decisive, elevated, protected, or superior. For a moment, the person feels larger. Later, they discover that the sensation depended upon a condition they could not command. Control is one counterfeit. The controlling person feels powerful while every variable is arranged and every person behaves as expected. The moment uncertainty enters, the power collapses into panic. What looked like strength was favorable conditions. Control says, "I am safe only when nothing moves without my permission." Authority says, "I can remain directed while much of life remains beyond permission." Certainty is another counterfeit. The mind hates unfinished questions. A quick explanation ends the discomfort. This person is entirely wrong. This opportunity is destined. This symptom means catastrophe. This teaching explains everything. The answer may be inaccurate, but it creates relief. Real power can say, "I do not know yet," without treating uncertainty as humiliation. Intensity is another counterfeit. A powerful emotional state can feel like transformation. The person hears a teaching, makes a declaration, and feels the old life disappear. Then the state changes. If no structure was built, they search for another peak, another promise, another dramatic identity. Intensity gives the sensation of movement. Discipline reveals whether movement occurred. Visibility and approval are closely related counterfeits. When the work is noticed, the person feels real. When the response is silent, they question its value. Praise becomes identity. Disagreement becomes collapse. And the self turns into a product receiving constant market feedback. Visibility can connect meaningful work with an audience. Approval can offer useful feedback. The counterfeit begins when borrowed eyes become the only court capable of declaring worth. Other imitations grow from the same root. Superiority needs someone beneath you. Aggression needs an opponent. Productivity requires endless output. Indifference protects itself by allowing nothing to matter. These forms appear different, but each makes strength dependent upon something that can disappear. Real power can organize what is controllable without demanding total control. It can welcome intensity without worshiping it, receive praise without becoming praise, achieve without treating rest as disappearance, and care deeply without becoming owned by outcome. Use the collapse test. Ask of any power you believe you possess. What happens when the supporting condition disappears? Who am I when they disagree? Who am I when the result is delayed? Who am I when the body cannot produce at the old level? Who am I when no one notices? The answer reveals whether power is rooted or rented. Then, notice the aftertaste. Counterfeit power often feels strong during the act and leaves weakness afterward. Control creates more vigilance. Superiority creates more separation. Aggression creates consequence. Overwork creates emptiness. Chasing approval creates the need for another dose. Real power may feel difficult during the act and steadier afterward. The boundary is uncomfortable, but self-respect remains. The truth is frightening, but inner division decreases. The pause feels vulnerable, but consequence is reduced. Do not ask only, do I feel powerful? Ask whether you are becoming more capable of seeing clearly, choosing proportionately, staying present, receiving feedback, acting without guaranteed approval, and returning after failure. Capacity is quieter than intensity. It is also more useful when life becomes difficult. The 9 powers that follow are not designed to make you feel invincible. They are designed to make you increasingly trustworthy with your own life. And the first power must come first, because whatever controls your attention is already deciding which world you are able to see. Power 1. Attention, what receives your life. Attention appears small because it leaves no visible object behind. You cannot hold yesterday's attention in your hand. You cannot place it on a table and measure its weight. Yet, attention is the substance from which a life is built. Whatever repeatedly receives it grows more detailed, more emotionally charged, and more influential. A fear becomes a landscape. A resentment becomes a private courtroom. A desire becomes a direction. A skill becomes a capacity. A relationship becomes intimacy. A neglected value becomes difficult to remember. This is why attention is not merely concentration. It is allocation of life. Imagine a woman in her late 50s who wakes before sunrise. She has plans for the day. She wants to walk, complete an application, call her sister, and spend 1 quiet hour on work she has postponed for years. Before her feet touch the floor, she reaches for the phone. A message contains bad news. A headline contains outrage. A photograph contains someone else's success. An advertisement creates dissatisfaction with a problem she did not know she had. 10 minutes later, the mind that had awakened with direction is carrying urgency, comparison, anger, and deficiency. Nothing in the room changed. The day changed because its first territory was occupied. She may still complete her plans, but now she must carry them through an emotional climate selected by strangers. This happens so often that it no longer feels like surrender. It feels normal. The first forgotten truth about attention is that what enters first often becomes the lens through which what follows is interpreted. This does not mean the first 5 minutes determine destiny. It means beginnings create momentum. A mind that begins in contact with its own values meets the world differently from a mind that begins inside the world's demands. Ancient disciplines understood this without modern notifications. Stoic practitioners prepared the mind before entering public life. Contemplative traditions protected silence at the beginning and end of the day. The purpose was not to escape reality. It was to meet reality before being colonized by it. Attention can be captured by threat because the nervous system is designed to notice what may harm us. This function is necessary. The problem begins when industries, relationships, and habits learn to use that sensitivity as a permanent doorway. Outrage is profitable because it holds attention. Comparison is profitable because it creates insufficiency. Urgency is profitable because it weakens examination. Fear is profitable because a frightened person keeps checking. The attention economy does not need you to believe everything it shows you. It only needs you to keep looking. But attention has another property. It deepens what it touches. A musician hears distinctions in sound that others miss because years of attention created a world of detail. A gardener notices the first sign of stress in a leaf because care has trained perception. A loving friend hears strain beneath an ordinary sentence because attention has become relationship. A craftsperson sees imbalance before the untrained eye can name it. Attention is the doorway through which reality becomes intimate. This means you are not only protecting yourself from distraction when you reclaim attention, you are recovering the ability to perceive more deeply. Many people say they have lost purpose when they have actually lost sustained contact with what gives purpose. They touch everything briefly and nothing long enough to receive instruction from it. They sample teachings, projects, people, and identities. Each creates a momentary spark. Nothing remains under attention long enough to become a fire. The mature mind must learn the difference between exposure and devotion. Exposure says, I have seen this. Devotion says, I have stayed long enough for this to change the way I see. A book can be exposed to the eyes and never enter the life. A relationship can occupy years and never receive honest attention. A body can carry a person for decades while being noticed only when it hurts. A dream can be discussed repeatedly while never receiving one protected hour. Attention reveals what you actually value more accurately than intention does. You may say, health matters. Your attention may repeatedly serve exhaustion. You may say, peace matters. Your attention may rehearse conflict. You may say your work matters. Your attention may remain available to every interruption except the work. You may say family matters. Your body may be present while attention is elsewhere. This is not a reason for shame. It is a reason for honesty. The first practice is an attention audit. At the end of one ordinary day, do not judge yourself. Simply ask, what received the first part of my mind? What repeatedly interrupted me? What did I return to without choosing? What strengthened me? What left me more agitated but no more capable? What important thing received almost nothing? The purpose is not to create a perfect schedule. Perfection can become another form of distraction. The purpose is to see where life is flowing. The second practice is to protect one threshold. Choose either the first 15 minutes of the morning or the final 15 minutes before sleep. During that threshold, do not enter messages, news, comparison, or argument. Let your own consciousness arrive before the crowd enters. Use the time simply. Sit in silence. Read one page slowly. Write the one action that matters most. Notice the state of the body. Pray without demanding an emotion. Look at the day before the day begins, looking at you. The third practice is the return phrase. When attention is captured, do not insult yourself. Say, this is where my life went. Now I return it. Return to the conversation. Return to the page. Return to the body. Return to the task. Return to the person in front of you. Every return is a small recovery of power. At first, you may return 50 times in 1 hour. That does not mean the practice is failing. It means you are becoming conscious of how often attention leaves. A person who never notices distraction believes they are free because no chain is visible. A person who notices and returns is already learning the weight and shape of the chain. Attention also determines what evidence becomes available. If you repeatedly look for disrespect, the mind will become skilled at finding it. If you repeatedly look for danger, uncertainty will begin resembling threat. If you repeatedly look for proof that you are too late, every younger person becomes evidence against your future. But attention is not positive thinking. You should not ignore danger, injustice, illness, debt, or grief. Reclaimed attention does not look away from reality. It looks at reality deliberately. It can face the medical result without spending the entire night inside imagined catastrophe. It can examine the account without converting a number into a moral verdict. It can hear criticism without allowing one voice to erase every other source of information. It can grieve what was lost while still noticing what remains alive. The strongest attention is not narrow denial. It is the capacity to remain with truth without becoming consumed by only one part of truth. If these words are helping you recognize where your life has been flowing without your permission, take a quiet moment to subscribe and remain connected to this work. The purpose is not to help you consume more information. It is to help you recover the powers that information alone cannot replace. Attention chooses what enters the inner world, but attention alone does not determine the life that follows. Two people can look at the same event and walk away, carrying entirely different realities. The next power decides why. Power 2. Interpretation. The meaning before the outcome. Interpretation can make it happen for years. A relationship ends. The event is real. The interpretation says, no one will ever stay. A business fails. The event is real. The interpretation says, I am not capable of building anything. A diagnosis arrives. The event is real. The interpretation says, my life is already over. A friend becomes distant. The event is real. The interpretation says, I have never mattered to anyone. A person turns 60 and notices the passage of time. The event is real. The interpretation says, every meaningful beginning belongs to the young. The event enters time. The interpretation enters identity. This is why interpretation is one of the most powerful and least examined abilities of the human mind. We assume meaning is contained inside circumstance, as though every event arrives with a final explanation attached. But meaning is not found only. It is also made. This does not mean you can call betrayal love, injustice fairness, or illness imagination. Interpretation is not permission to deny facts. It is the work of deciding what the facts are allowed to mean about the whole of your life. The Stoic tradition built much of its discipline around the difference between an impression and the judgment added to it. An impression can arrive quickly. Danger, insult, loss, rejection. Judgment completes the sentence. This is unbearable. This defines me. This will never change. I must act now. When judgment remains invisible, it feels like reality itself. Consider a man who receives a rejection after applying for work. The message is brief. Another candidate was selected. Within seconds, the mind produces a complete biography. I waited too long to change careers. My experience has no value. The world no longer has a place for someone my age. My family will see that I've failed. I should stop trying before I humiliate myself again. The email contained none of these sentences. The mind supplied them because old fear was waiting for material. Now imagine another interpretation. This opportunity closed. The disappointment is real. I may need better positioning, stronger evidence of skill, a different market, or more attempts. One decision cannot measure the entire value of my experience. I will learn what can be learned before I decide what this means. The second interpretation is not guaranteed optimism. It does not promise that the next application succeeds. It preserves movement by refusing to turn incomplete evidence into a final identity. The power of interpretation operates in both directions. It can enlarge suffering, but it can also romanticize danger. A person may call neglect freedom, may call obsession love, may call impulsiveness intuition, may call avoidance peace, may call control responsibility, may call exhaustion devotion. Therefore, the goal is not to choose the most comforting story. It is to choose the most honest and life-giving meaning available. Honest means it respects facts. Life-giving means it preserves the possibility of wise response. A useful interpretation should make you more capable of truth, not less. This gives us a test. After interpreting an event, ask, does this meaning increase clarity or only intensity? Does it identify what happened? Or does it condemn the whole self? Does it reveal an action, a boundary, a repair, or a need for care? Does it allow new evidence to enter? Would I give this interpretation to someone I love in the same circumstances? Fear often speaks in total words. Always, never, everyone, no one, ruined, finished, impossible. These words create emotional certainty when reality remains complex. They are attractive because uncertainty is difficult to carry. A painful absolute can feel safer than an unfinished question. But the price of false certainty is a future organized around a conclusion that may not be true. Interpretation also shapes memory. The mind does not store life as an objective archive. It organizes memory around current meaning. When you feel rejected, earlier rejections become easier to remember. When you feel ashamed, failures gather like witnesses. When you feel grateful, overlooked support becomes visible. The past seems to change because the present state chooses which parts of the past are invited to speak. This is why one mood can make your entire life appear to have always been empty, while another reveals that help, beauty, and endurance were present more often than you noticed. The power is not in pretending one archive is complete. The power is in recognizing that no state should be allowed to select all the evidence alone. The first practice is exact description. Replace interpretation with fact before rebuilding meaning. Instead of, my life is falling apart, say, the relationship ended. The payment is late. The body is exhausted. I do not know what happens next. Fear is adding a total conclusion. Instead of, nobody respects me, say, this person interrupted me repeatedly. I felt dismissed. I need to decide whether to address it, reduce access, or change my expectation. Instead of, I have wasted my life, say, there are years I wish I had used differently. There are consequences I cannot erase. There is still a life in front of me asking what I will do with what I now understand. Exactness does not reduce pain. It prevents pain from becoming mythology. The second practice is the provisional sentence. When evidence is incomplete, use language that leaves room for truth. I do not understand this yet. This is painful, but it is not the whole story. The method failed. The value may remain. The relationship ended. My capacity to love did not. The body changed. Dignity did not disappear. I made a serious mistake. I am still responsible for what I build next. A provisional sentence is not weakness. It is intellectual humility under emotional pressure. The third practice is the second meaning. After the first interpretation arrives, ask for another that is equally honest. The first meaning may be, They rejected me because I am inadequate. The second may be, their decision reflects needs, timing, preference, and information I do not fully possess. The first may be, my fear proves I should not continue. The second may be, fear often appears when a meaningful action contains uncertainty. The first may be, I am behind. The second may be, I am beginning from the place my life has actually brought me, not from the place comparison says I should have begun. You do not need to believe the second meaning immediately. You need only prevent the first from becoming the only authority in the room. Interpretation is where fate often begins to feel inevitable. A repeated meaning becomes expectation. Expectation shapes attention. Attention shapes action. Action creates consequences. Consequences return as proof. The person who believes conflict always ends in abandonment may hide needs, test loyalty, or leave first. The resulting distance confirms the interpretation. The person who believes money is proof of worth may avoid the account when numbers are low. Avoidance worsens the situation and shame deepens. The person who believes age has closed the future may stop learning, reaching, and offering. The absence of new opportunity then appears to prove that time was the cause. Interpretation does not control every outcome. It influences participation powerfully enough to shape many of them. This is why the meaning you choose before the outcome is not a decorative thought. It is a set of instructions for perception and behavior. Yet meaning alone cannot create a future. It must become visible before it can become actionable. That is the work of imagination, the power anxiety already knows how to use. The first test, the court of other people, how approval borrows your voice. There is a courtroom many people enter before making even private decisions. The judges are not physically present. A parent who may disapprove, a former partner who may feel proven right, colleagues who may laugh, friends who may withdraw, strangers who may misunderstand, an audience that may not respond. The person stands before this invisible court and presents the case for their own life. Is this dream respectable enough? Is this boundary justified enough? Is this change too late? Will they think I failed? Will they call me selfish? Will they believe I am afraid? The court rarely closes because every verdict creates another appeal. Approval is not a trivial need. Human beings form identity in relationship. We learn language, safety, value, and belonging through other people. Rejection can activate the body as threat because exclusion once carried serious consequences for survival. The problem is not that approval matters. The problem is that it can become jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the right to decide. Another person may have information about you. They may be affected by your action. They may deserve consideration, explanation, or repair. But information is not total jurisdiction over identity. A parent can dislike the path without knowing the whole path. A partner can feel disappointed without every disappointment becoming evidence that the boundary is wrong. An audience can remain silent without silence, measuring the value of the work completely. A critic can identify one weakness without defining the whole creator. A family can prefer the old version of you because that version made their lives easier. Approval often becomes most dangerous during transformation. When you stop performing a familiar role, the people organized around that role experience change. The always available person becomes less available. The peacemaker stops absorbing conflict. The child who obeyed becomes an adult who questions. The worker who over-delivered begins setting limits. The person who explained everything stops defending every choice. The family may call this selfishness, pride, instability, or ingratitude. Sometimes they are identifying a real excess. Sometimes they are naming the discomfort created when access changes. Inner authority does not assume every critic is wrong. That would be another prison. It asks, is there truth in the feedback? Is there authority in the source? Is there responsibility I must honor? Is the criticism about harm or about lost control over me? What would I believe if applause and condemnation were both absent? This last question is difficult because many choices were built inside reaction to other people. Some people obey approval, others rebel against it. Both remain governed by the court. The obedient person says yes because they want acceptance. The rebellious person says no because they want to prove independence. Inner authority can choose yes or no without making either choice a performance for the judges. Imagine a woman considering returning to school in her early 60s. She feels drawn toward counseling after years of caring informally for others. The desire is real, but the courtroom becomes crowded. Some voices say the cost is foolish. Some say she is too old. Some say she should be content. Some say the family may need her. Some praise the idea so enthusiastically that she begins feeling pressure to prove them right. The decision becomes impossible because every imagined reaction receives equal weight. Inner authority does not silence the court through defiance. It reorganizes the witnesses. What is the financial reality? What training is required? What responsibilities exist? What alternatives are available? What desire has persisted after emotion changes? What would be regretted if no exploration occurred? What scale is realistic? The decision returns from approval to examination. The first practice is the jurisdiction list. Write the names or roles of those whose opinions occupy your decisions. Beside each, ask what authority they genuinely possess. A physician may have authority regarding medical evidence, not the total meaning of your life. A financial advisor may have expertise regarding numbers, not the right to choose your values. A partner may have legitimate interests in shared decisions, not ownership of your conscience. A stranger may have an opinion and no jurisdiction at all. The second practice is the silent decision. Before announcing a change, allow it to become coherent privately. Examine facts. Test the action. Build structure. Let the decision gain roots before exposing it to every wind. Premature announcement can turn a tender direction into a social performance. Praise creates pressure. Criticism creates defensiveness. The person begins acting for the court instead of the value. The third practice is the misunderstood life. Ask what truth you would still need to live if some people never understood it. Not because understanding is unimportant. Communication matters. But some decisions cannot be made dependent upon universal comprehension. You may need to leave without receiving agreement that leaving was necessary. May need to rest while others call you unproductive. May need to seek treatment in a family that hides suffering. May need to forgive without restoring access. May need to create work that your immediate environment cannot value. May need to begin later than the culture considers impressive. The discipline of being misunderstood is not indifference. It is grief with direction. You may feel the loss of approval. You may wish they could see. You may continue speaking respectfully. You may revise when valid feedback appears, and still refuse to abandon the truth solely to end the discomfort of their opinion. The court becomes quieter when you stop presenting endless evidence. Some people are not waiting for clarity. They are waiting for surrender. Another explanation will not create understanding where understanding is not desired. This does not make them evil. It makes the limit visible. The deepest approval problem is not outside. It is the internal judge created from years of borrowed voices. Long after the parent is gone, the sentence remains. Long after the teacher is forgotten, the humiliation remains. Long after the relationship ends, the imagined criticism continues. The person no longer needs an external judge because the court has been installed within. Interpretation and imagination keep it active. A future action is evaluated through an old audience. This is why reclaiming approval requires compassion toward the earlier self. Belonging may once have depended upon adaptation. Silence may have protected connection. Performance may have created safety. The strategy should not be hated. It should be recognized as outdated authority. You can say inwardly, "I understand why approval became important. I will still listen. I will still care. I will not give every voice a vote equal to conscience, evidence, responsibility, and truth." The court of other people does not disappear completely. Human beings will always influence one another. The change is that the courtroom becomes advisory rather than sovereign. And once approval no longer writes the whole future, imagination becomes available for something other than rehearsing judgment. Power 3. Imagination. Rehearsing what has not yet happened. Imagination is often treated as a luxury of childhood, an artistic gift, or a spiritual tool used only for desired outcomes. In reality, imagination is active every day, and anxiety is one of its most disciplined practitioners. An anxious mind does not merely think that something could go wrong. It stages the event. It hears the tone of the conversation. It sees the face of disappointment. It feels the humiliation before anyone has spoken. It writes the future, enters it emotionally, and returns carrying evidence from a place that does not yet exist. The body responds to the rehearsal. The heart accelerates. The muscles tighten. Attention narrows. By the time the real moment arrives, the person is not entering a new event. They are entering the latest performance of a scene practiced many times. This is the hidden power of imagination. It prepares participation. It does not guarantee that reality will obey every image. It does influence which possibilities feel available, which actions seem natural, how the body prepares, and what the mind expects to notice. A person who repeatedly imagines rejection may speak defensively before rejection occurs. A person who repeatedly imagines failure may delay preparation because effort feels pointless. A person who repeatedly imagines conflict may interpret neutrality as attack. A person who imagines only perfect success may become unable to tolerate ordinary difficulty. Imagination can imprison through catastrophe and intoxicate through fantasy. Both distort participation. The mature use of imagination is neither fearful prediction nor magical certainty. It is deliberate rehearsal for a way of being. Consider a woman preparing to have a difficult conversation with her adult son. For weeks, she has imagined the argument. In every version, he becomes defensive, she loses control, old accusations return, and the relationship is damaged. Each rehearsal ends with the same conclusion: there is no point speaking. Her imagination has not protected the relationship. It has trained avoidance. Now imagine a different rehearsal. She sees herself sitting down calmly. She feels the discomfort in her chest without interpreting it as danger. She states one truth without presenting 10 years of evidence. She listens without surrendering the boundary. She allows the conversation to remain unfinished if respect disappears. This rehearsal does not guarantee her son's response. It prepares her own. That distinction protects imagination from superstition. The purpose is not to control another person inside the mind. The purpose is to become familiar with the conduct you wish to carry into uncertainty. Athletes use mental rehearsal because the nervous system learns from patterned attention. Musicians hear passages inwardly before performing them. Speakers practice the opening sentence until the body no longer experiences it as foreign. Contemplative traditions imagine compassion before entering difficult contact. The mechanism differs across disciplines, but the principle remains. What is rehearsed becomes more accessible. Most people rehearse outcomes. A wiser person rehearses qualities. Instead of rehearsing applause, rehearse presence. Instead of rehearsing total agreement, rehearse clarity. Instead of rehearsing a life without obstacles, rehearse the ability to meet obstacles without abandoning direction. Instead of rehearsing a body that never suffers, rehearse care, patience, and the willingness to seek help. Instead of rehearsing certainty, rehearse honest action under uncertainty. This is stronger than fantasy because it remains useful even when the outcome changes. Imagination also reveals hidden loyalties. Notice which future the mind returns to repeatedly. Some people imagine success and immediately add punishment. If I become visible, I will be attacked. If I earn more, people will use me. If I become healthy, I will lose the excuse to avoid life. If I love again, I will be abandoned again. The desired future is present, but it is surrounded by danger. The problem may not be lack of desire. It may be that imagination has linked the desire to a threat. This is why affirmations sometimes fail. The conscious sentence says, I am ready. The imagination shows exposure, loss, judgment, and responsibility. The body trusts the rehearsal more than the words. To work intelligently, do not shout over the image. Examine it. What do you believe would become dangerous if the desire were fulfilled? What responsibility would arrive? What identity would be lost? Who might no longer recognize you? What familiar excuse would disappear? What form of protection would the old limitation no longer provide? The imagination is not always resisting growth. Sometimes it is protecting an identity that once survived through limitation. The first practice is one scene, one quality, one action. Choose a real situation that matters, not an entire future. One scene. See the room, the task, or the conversation. Choose one quality you want available. Patience, courage, precision, warmth, restraint, dignity. Then rehearse one action that expresses that quality. You open the account and remain present. You enter the appointment with questions written down. You submit the work before perfection gives permission. You say no without an unnecessary speech. You receive criticism and wait before responding. You begin again without announcing a new identity to everyone around you. The second practice is to complete the feared scene beyond the point where anxiety usually stops. Fear often ends the movie at catastrophe. You make a mistake, end. They reject you, end. The plan fails, end. The relationship changes, end. Continue the scene. You breathe. You ask what can be repaired. You seek support. You learn. You grieve. You adjust the method. You survive the embarrassment. You discover that the feared event was painful without becoming the end of identity. Anxiety gains power by presenting difficulty without aftermath, as though the human spirit disappears at the moment of impact. Mature imagination includes recovery. The third practice is evidence from the future self. Imagine not that everything went perfectly, but that 1 year has passed and you are grateful for how you handled this season. What did you stop doing? What did you finally face? What did you practice before it felt natural? What support did you accept? What truth did you stop negotiating? What ordinary action became the turning point? Let the future self provide instruction. not prophecy. Imagination can also heal the relationship with age. A mature audience is often told that imagination belongs to the young because the future is assumed to shrink with time. But time does not remove the power to envision another way of living. It changes the scale and honesty of the vision. At 20, imagination may ask what life could become. At 60, it may ask what life no longer needs to pretend. At 70, it may ask what truth deserves the remaining years. At any age, imagination can reveal a form of courage the current identity has not yet practiced. Do not confuse a smaller horizon with a smaller life. A single repaired relationship, a body treated with dignity, a craft finally begun, a fear no longer obeyed, a family pattern interrupted, or a truth spoken after decades of silence can contain more transformation than 1,000 dramatic ambitions. Keep this distinction in mind. Imagination does not need a louder promise. It needs a conscious direction and a moment in which impulse can be interrupted. Attention selects the material. Interpretation gives it meaning. Imagination rehearses what may follow. But a rehearsal cannot govern action unless there is a moment in which impulse is interrupted. That moment is the fourth power. Power 4. Power 4. Pause. The interval where freedom returns. There is a moment so brief that most people miss it. A message appears. The body contracts. A story forms. An impulse rises. The hand begins moving toward a reply. Between the event and the action, there is an interval. Sometimes it lasts several seconds. Sometimes one breath. Sometimes it appears only after the reaction has already begun. This interval is the birthplace of freedom. Without it, the past responds to the present before the present has been understood. The criticism activates every earlier humiliation. The silence activates every earlier abandonment. The unexpected expense activates every earlier season of scarcity. The authority figure activates every earlier experience of powerlessness. The current event becomes crowded with old witnesses, and the response is made to all of them at once. A pause does not erase the history. It prevents history from speaking alone. Modern life treats speed as competence. The quickest reply appears intelligent. The immediate decision appears decisive. The instant opinion appears informed. But speed often serves the part of the mind most threatened by uncertainty. Urgency promises relief. Reply now, and the tension will end. Buy now, and the deficiency will quiet. Leave now, and vulnerability will stop. Explain now, and they may finally understand. Promise now, and the elevated feeling will become real. The action is presented as solution, but often it is emotional discharge. The pause asks a different question. What will remain after the relief passes? Imagine a man receiving an accusation from a colleague late at night. The message is unfair and written in a tone that threatens his reputation. Anger rises immediately. He begins composing a detailed response. Every sentence is accurate enough to defend and sharp enough to wound. He is not lying. He is also not free. The body wants release more than the mind wants resolution. If he sends the message, he may feel powerful for 10 minutes. In the morning, the original problem will remain, joined by the consequences of his tone. The pause does not require passivity. It may lead to a stronger response, but it allows the purpose of the response to become visible. Am I trying to clarify, protect, correct, punish, display superiority, end discomfort, force an answer? Different purposes require different actions. The nervous system is not an enemy in this process. It is attempting to protect. When threat is perceived, perception narrows and speed becomes attractive. The body prepares for action before philosophy can deliver a lecture. This is why the pause must be physical before it becomes intellectual. Move away from the device. Unclench the jaw. Feel the feet. Lengthen the exhale. Drink a water. Walk once around the room. Name the sensation. The body cannot be argued out of activation by a sentence alone. It must receive evidence that immediate action is not required. The first practice is the 3-layer pause. Name the body. Heat in the face. Tightness in the chest. Speed in the hands. Numbness. Pressure. Shaking. Name the story. They are disrespecting me. I'm about to lose everything. I must prove myself. No one listens unless I become forceful. Name the impulse. Attack. Withdraw. Spend. Explain. Check. Promise. End. Hide. Separating these layers creates space. The body can be supported. The story can be examined. The impulse can be delayed. The second practice is the honorable delay. Create rules before emotional emergency arrives. No ending a relationship in panic. No large purchase in exhilaration or fear. No public response while humiliated. No major promise during spiritual intensity. No life verdict after midnight. No medical conclusion without qualified care. No permanent identity built from one difficult day. A rule created in clarity becomes a form of borrowed wisdom when clarity temporarily leaves. The third practice is delayed speech. When possible, replace immediate response with a sentence that preserves time. I want to answer carefully. I will return to this tomorrow. I hear what you are saying. I need time before I respond. This matters, and I do not want urgency to decide the tone. I cannot agree now. I will consider what is actually possible. A pause can be communicated without becoming disappearance. This matters in relationships because silence can also be used as punishment. The purpose is not to make another person anxious. It is to protect truth from reaction. The pause is equally necessary during positive emotion. Excitement can overpromise. Relief can reopen a door that clarity closed. Praise can create commitments beyond capacity. Spiritual intensity can make every impulse feel ordained. The high state says, begin everything. The pause asks, what can still be honored when the feeling changes? Some of the most expensive decisions are not made in despair. They are made in exhilaration. The pause also changes the relationship with regret. Many people believe awareness is useless if it arrives after the reaction. They say, I noticed too late. But late awareness is the first form of earlier awareness. At first, you notice after sending the message. Then while writing it. Then as the body begins to heat. Then when the familiar trigger appears. Eventually, the event meets a prepared consciousness. Do not despise the stage you are in. Freedom grows through recognition, becoming earlier. There are situations in which immediate action is necessary. A child is in danger. A medical emergency occurs. A boundary must be enforced. The pause is not a command to delay what safety requires. It is a discipline for moments when emotion is presenting urgency as proof. A true pause makes action more proportionate. It can turn anger into a boundary, fear into preparation, shame into repair, excitement into structure, grief into a request for support, confusion into a question. The pause does not create courage automatically. It creates the space in which courage can be chosen. Because once you stop reacting, another difficulty appears. You must decide what to do without waiting for certainty to remove fear. Power 5. Courage, moving before certainty. Courage is often imagined as a dramatic feeling, a surge of confidence, a moment in which fear disappears and the person finally knows exactly what to do. This image makes courage difficult to recognize because most courageous actions do not feel courageous while they are happening. They feel exposed, incomplete, uncomfortable, ordinary. A person tells the truth with a dry mouth, makes the appointment while afraid of the answer, leaves a familiar pattern before the new life is visible, begins again at an age when comparison says beginnings should be over, apologizes without controlling whether forgiveness will be given, submits the work before confidence arrives, asks for help while shame is still present. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that another value deserves a voice in the room. Fear says, protect yourself from uncertainty. Courage says, protect what matters from fear. This distinction prevents courage from becoming recklessness. Recklessness dismisses danger. Courage sees danger and chooses proportionate action because the cost of permanent avoidance has become greater. Aristotle described courage as a balance between cowardice and rashness. The insight remains useful. One extreme allows fear to govern. The other uses action to avoid feeling fear at all. Mature courage can remain in contact with both risk and value. Consider a man who has spent 30 years in work that no longer resembles his values. He is not in a position to abandon income impulsively. He has responsibilities, health concerns, and people who depend on him. He also knows that continuing unchanged is slowly reducing him. Recklessness says, leave tomorrow and call uncertainty freedom. Cowardice says, remain forever and call fear responsibility. Courage asks for a third path. Learn the skill. Reduce unnecessary debt. Test the idea. Speak with those affected. Create a transition. Take one action that makes a different future more possible. Courage is often strategic. It does not need to prove itself through maximum risk. It needs to stop using risk as a permanent excuse for non-participation. Many people are waiting for certainty before acting. But certainty often arrives after action has produced information. You do not know whether you can speak publicly until you begin speaking. You do not know whether the new boundary can survive until it is tested. You do not know whether the work will find an audience until it exists. You do not know whether trust can be rebuilt until both people participate in repair. You do not know whether a later chapter of life can become meaningful until you begin writing it. Action creates evidence that thought alone cannot provide. This is why fear can persist for years inside preparation. Preparation is valuable, but it can become a respectable form of avoidance when no threshold is ever crossed. Another course, another book, another plan, another conversation about the action. The person remains informed and unchanged. The first practice of courage is the next honest act. Do not ask for the most dramatic act. Ask what honesty requires next. One phone call, one page. One application, one boundary, one question at the appointment. 1 hour of practice. One conversation in which you stop pretending not to know what you know. The next honest act should be small enough to perform and significant enough to interrupt avoidance. The second practice is fear with a task. Fear becomes overwhelming when it is asked to predict the entire future. Give it a proportionate job. If fear is about money, let it help you gather the numbers. If fear is about health, let it help you prepare questions and seek qualified care. If fear is about rejection, let it help you improve the offer without deciding your worth. If fear is about conflict, let it help you choose timing, tone, and boundaries. Fear can contribute information without receiving command. The third practice is to decide what you are willing to feel. People often say they are unwilling to take an action, when what they mean is that they are unwilling to feel the emotion attached to it. I am not willing to be embarrassed. I am not willing to disappoint them. I am not willing to feel uncertain. I am not willing to grieve the identity I must leave. I am not willing to be a beginner. Courage begins when you choose a meaningful discomfort consciously. I am willing to feel awkward while learning. I am willing to feel grief while ending what is harmful. I am willing to feel fear while protecting the body. I am willing to feel misunderstood while speaking truthfully. I am willing to feel uncertainty while building a more honest life. This is not self-punishment. It is the refusal to make comfort the highest authority. Courage changes with age. The courage of early life may involve leaving home, risking failure, and forming identity. The courage of later life may involve releasing an identity that once brought respect, admitting the body has needs, beginning after loss, receiving help, forgiving without reopening access, or using the remaining years without waiting for the past to approve. There is no age at which courage becomes irrelevant. The object changes. The inner movement remains. A person may need courage to stop striving, to rest, to receive, to say they are lonely, to accept that a relationship cannot be repaired by one person, to use their experience in service instead of bitterness, to create something no one in the family understands, to live the second half of life from truth rather than accumulated expectation. The commercial world often sells courage as domination. Win, defeat, prove, silence the critics. But some of the highest courage is quiet. The courage to remain kind without becoming weak. The courage to correct yourself publicly. The courage to let another person be disappointed without abandoning a necessary boundary. The courage to continue meaningful work before recognition. The courage to end the performance of being fine. The courage to face a fact that spiritual language cannot erase. Courage opens the door. It does not carry you through every day that follows. For that, another power is required. The power that remains when the emotion that began the journey has already disappeared. Power 6. Discipline. The promise that outlives motivation. Motivation is a visitor. Discipline is an address. Motivation arrives with energy, vision, and emotional permission. It makes difficult work appear obvious. It creates plans, declarations, schedules, and promises. For a few hours or days, the future feels close. Then the state changes. The body is tired. The task becomes ordinary. No one notices. The result is delayed. The original excitement becomes difficult to remember. This is where many people conclude that the desire was false. Often the desire was real. The structure was missing. Discipline is misunderstood when it is presented as cruelty toward the self. Endless pressure, sleep ignored. The body treated as an obstacle, worth measured by output. This is not discipline. It is domination turned inward. True discipline protects a chosen direction from temporary states. It says, "This matters even when the feeling changes." A promise made only while inspired is not yet a promise. It is a description of the current mood. Discipline begins when the mood is no longer required to agree. Imagine a woman caring for an aging parent while trying to preserve a small creative practice of her own. She has little uninterrupted time. Some days, she is emotionally and physically exhausted. The fantasy of discipline tells her that real creators work for hours at dawn and never miss a day. The comparison creates shame, and shame makes the work feel impossible. A wiser discipline asks what can be protected inside the life that actually exists. 20 minutes 3 times a week. 1 page, 1 recorded idea while sitting in the car. 1 protected afternoon each month with support arranged in advance. The practice is modest, but it has a place to live. Discipline does not demand that life become ideal before meaning is allowed to continue. This is why systems are spiritual. A calendar can preserve a value. A prepared meal can protect the body. A removed number can protect a boundary. A written budget can protect a future. A recurring appointment can protect care. An environment can remember what emotion forgets. People often rely on willpower in settings designed for the old pattern. The harmful contact remains 1 tap away. The distraction remains open beside the work. The spending trigger remains connected to saved payment information. The medicine is hidden where it will be forgotten. The desired practice has no time, place, or visible cue. Then the person blames character for what structure repeatedly undermines. Discipline asks not only, how strong am I? It asks, what environment am I rehearsing? The first practice is the minimum faithful act. Choose the smallest action that preserves relationship with the direction. Open the document. Walk for 10 minutes. Review 1 account. Practice 1 passage. Make 1 nourishing meal. Read 1 page with attention. Sit in silence for 5 minutes. Send 1 honest proposal. The act should be too small to impress the ego and meaningful enough to prevent abandonment. This is not lowering the vision. It is building continuity. A bridge is not valued because each stone is dramatic. It is valued because the stones remain connected. The second practice is the fixed appointment. Decide when and where the action occurs before the state votes. Not, I will write when I feel clear. Tuesday at 7. At the table for 30 minutes. Not, I will look at money when I feel less anxious. Friday morning with the numbers, before avoidance has another week. Not, I will rest when everything is finished. The body will receive a protected hour because everything is never finished. The appointment turns intention into geography. The third practice is the rule of reduction, not abandonment. When capacity is lower, reduce the form while preserving the relationship. Write 1 paragraph instead of 5 pages. Walk around the block instead of completing the full routine. Offer 1 prayer instead of demanding an hour of perfect concentration. Address 1 bill instead of solving the entire financial life tonight. Tell 1 truth instead of presenting the whole history. The low capacity day does not need to become a 0. This is especially important for people living with illness, grief, caregiving, disability, or chronic stress. Discipline must cooperate with reality. A rigid system that ignores the body eventually teaches the body that the chosen life is unsafe. Compassion and discipline are not opposites. Compassion determines the proportion. Discipline preserves the direction. The fourth practice is repair without drama. You will miss the appointment. You will break the rule. You will return to the old pattern. The undisciplined response is not the mistake. It is the story built afterward. I ruined everything. I have no consistency. I knew I would fail. The dramatic collapse gives 1 missed act authority over the entire direction. Repair says, I missed the act. Why? What needs to change? When is the next return? No public declaration, no self-punishment, no waiting for Monday, next month, or a new identity. Return at the next honest opportunity. Discipline becomes trustworthy when it includes a method for returning. If these teachings are giving you a stronger understanding of power than motivation alone can offer, subscribe and remain connected. The purpose of this work is not to produce another emotional high. It is to build an inner authority that remains after the high is gone. Discipline protects direction through time. But time contains suffering, loss, disappointment, and change. A person can continue acting and still ask why the action matters. Without meaning, discipline becomes machinery. The seventh power answers the question machinery cannot. The price. The price of inner authority. What you may lose when you stop being governed. Power is attractive when described as recovery. It becomes more difficult when recovery has a price. To reclaim attention, you may need to disappoint those who expect constant availability. To reclaim interpretation, you may need to release a story that protected innocence. To reclaim imagination, you may need to stop using fantasy as refuge. To reclaim pause, you may need to tolerate the feeling that immediate action once relieved. To reclaim courage, you may need to become visible as a beginner. To reclaim discipline, you may need to surrender the identity of someone who is always about to begin. To reclaim meaning, you may need to admit that the old goal no longer deserves your life. To reclaim renewal, you may need to grieve the self others preferred. To reclaim service, you may need to give without becoming indispensable. Inner authority can cost belonging, image, certainty, comfort, and familiar explanation. This does not mean loss is proof that every decision is right. People can become selfish and call it boundaries, can become rigid and call it discipline, can avoid accountability and call it inner authority. The price must be examined, not worshipped, but there are times when a true change does disturb the system around it. A family adapts to the person who never says no. A workplace adapts to the employee who absorbs unreasonable demands. A relationship adapts to the partner who apologizes for every conflict. A social group adapts to the person who performs a predictable identity. When that person changes, everyone loses something familiar. The reaction may be intense because the old arrangement was convenient. You are different. You have become difficult. You think you are better than us. You used to care. The accusation may contain a real warning. Change can produce arrogance, but it may also be the language of a system losing access. The first price is the loss of innocence. Awareness reveals participation. You may discover that a pattern was not only done to you, you also maintained it through silence, avoidance, rescue, repetition, or fear. This does not erase what others did. It reveals the part that now belongs to your responsibility. Innocence can feel safer than agency because agency includes the painful recognition that another response may now be required. The second price is grief. A false identity cannot be released without loss because it was not entirely false. It carried real relationships, achievements, protection, and memories. The strong one may have survived through strength. The caretaker may have expressed genuine love. The achiever may have built a meaningful life. The peacemaker may have prevented real harm. Renewal does not mock these identities. It thanks them and recognizes where their service has ended. The third price is uncertainty. Old patterns are predictable. Even suffering can become familiar enough to feel safe. The harmful relationship follows a known cycle. The unfulfilling job has known demands. The identity of failure protects against new exposure. When the old form is left, the new self may not yet exist strongly enough to provide confidence. This middle can feel empty. You are no longer who you were and not yet practiced in who you are becoming. Do not mistake the absence of a familiar identity for the absence of identity itself. The fourth price is responsibility. Once you recognize a power, ignorance becomes less available as an excuse. If you know attention is being captured, you must decide what to protect. If you know the interpretation is inherited, you must examine it. If you know fear is rehearsing the future, You must choose whether to continue the rehearsal. Awareness does not guarantee perfect action. It does make unconscious repetition increasingly uncomfortable. The fifth price is ordinary work. Many people are willing to experience revelation and unwilling to create structure. The insight is beautiful. The calendar is ordinary. The boundary is repetitive. The therapy appointment is inconvenient. The budget is unglamorous. The practice is quiet. The apology has no music. Real change enters time through ordinary forms. The price of authority is often boredom with integrity. The sixth price is lost approval. You may become less admirable to people who valued your compliance, less impressive to people who valued your productivity, less spiritual to people who confuse suffering with virtue, less easy to understand because the new life does not fit the old explanation. This loss can hurt even when the choice is right. Do not demand that truth make you emotionally untouched. The seventh price is the end of fantasy. A reclaimed life may be more possible and less dramatic than the fantasy that delayed it. The work may begin with one client, not a sudden audience. The body may improve through patient care, not instant transformation. The relationship may become healthier through repeated repair, not one perfect conversation. The later life may become meaningful through contribution, not reinvention into someone 20 years younger. Fantasy offers intensity without limitation. Reality offers participation. The price of participation is accepting form. The first practice is to name the payment. For the change you desire, what discomfort must be willingly carried? Disapproval, uncertainty, boredom, grief, responsibility, being a beginner, the loss of a familiar excuse. A cost named consciously is less likely to appear later as proof that the path is wrong. The second practice is to distinguish price from damage. A difficult conversation may be a price. Abuse is damage. Temporary uncertainty may be a price. Permanent financial recklessness may be damage. Disappointing someone may be a price. Abandoning legitimate responsibility may be damage. Inner authority does not glorify cost. It chooses proportionately. The third practice is the support structure. Do not pay the price alone if support is available. A therapist can help hold the identity transition. A physician can address the body. A financial professional can clarify risk. A trusted friend can remember the reason for a boundary when loneliness becomes loud. A community can make courage less solitary. The price of authority is not isolation. Sometimes, the most authoritative act is allowing qualified support to enter. You are not required to lose everything to prove that change is real. You are required to stop using every cost as evidence that the old prison was freedom. The power you recover will ask for a life capable of carrying it. Power 7. Meaning, what suffering cannot decide for you. Suffering is powerful, but it is not automatically wise. Pain can deepen a person. It can also make them smaller, more frightened, more bitter, or more isolated. Loss can reveal what matters. It can also convince someone that nothing matters. Hardship can awaken courage. It can also exhaust the capacity to imagine another future. The difference is not moral superiority. It is not proof that one person had stronger faith. Circumstance, support, health, history, resources, and the actions of others all matter. Meaning does not cancel these realities. Meaning answers a different question. Given what has happened, what will this experience be allowed to produce through me? This question does not justify suffering. It does not call abuse a gift, illness a spiritual failure, or tragedy a necessary lesson. Some events are simply wrong. Some losses should never have occurred. Some pain requires medicine, protection, justice, therapy, community, or time. Meaning begins after honesty. Viktor Frankl's work became influential because he insisted that even under extreme external restriction, human beings retain a relationship to meaning and response. His insight should not be simplified into the claim that attitude solves every condition. It points toward a more careful truth. Circumstances can reduce options severely without always eliminating the human capacity to choose what value will still be served. A person cannot always choose the event. They may still choose whether cruelty becomes permission to become cruel, whether grief becomes permanent isolation or deeper reverence for love, whether failure becomes identity or information, whether age becomes only subtraction or also clarification, whether a wound becomes the only story or one part of a larger life. Meaning is not found by asking why in a way that demands a cosmic explanation for every event. Sometimes no answer arrives. Sometimes an explanation would be insulting to the scale of the pain. Meaning can be built from responsibility rather than explanation. What requires care now? What truth must not be abandoned? Who depends upon my presence? What value can still be expressed? What must this pain not be allowed to destroy? Imagine a woman whose marriage ends after decades. The loss is not only a person, it is a future, a social identity, routines, shared memories, and the version of herself that existed inside the relationship. At first, meaning may be impossible to discuss. The task is survival, support, sleep, paperwork, and the next day. Later, the question changes. What did I silence to preserve this form? What part of me requires rebuilding? What kind of love do I want to practice now, including love toward myself? What wisdom can be carried without pretending the ending was good? Meaning does not transform the loss into a blessing. It prevents the loss from becoming the only author of what follows. There are 3 common distortions of meaning. The first is forced meaning. Everything happens for a reason. This sentence may comfort some people, but it can also silence grief and excuse harm. A mature philosophy does not demand that the suffering person discover gratitude on schedule. The second is borrowed meaning. A family, institution, religion, or culture may explain what your life should mean before you have encountered your own conscience. You may spend years serving a role that once brought belonging, but no longer contains truth. The third is achievement as meaning. The person believes life matters only when progress is visible. When illness, retirement, caregiving, or loss reduces productivity, identity collapses. The deeper question becomes unavoidable. Is a human life valuable only when it produces what the marketplace can measure? Meaning restores value to forms of life the culture overlooks. Keeping a frightened person company. Caring for a parent whose memory is fading. Preparing a meal when grief has removed appetite. Refusing to pass family cruelty into another generation. Teaching one person what took decades to learn. Remaining honest in a workplace that rewards performance over integrity. These actions may never become public achievements. They can still become the moral center of a life. The first practice is the question of preservation. Ask, what must this experience not be allowed to take from me? My capacity to love? My honesty? My ability to receive help? My relationship with the body? My willingness to create? My belief that another form of life remains possible? The answer identifies a value requiring protection. The second practice is the unfinished task. Meaning often appears through responsibility that remains. A conversation that needs honesty. A skill that should be passed on. A child who needs a different example. A body that needs care. a piece of work that expresses something true, a repair that remains possible, a boundary that ends the repetition of harm. The unfinished task does not need to be grand. It needs to be alive. The third practice is the double truth. Hold pain and value in the same sentence. This loss changed me, and love still deserves expression. The diagnosis frightens me, and the body still deserves care. I regret the years, and I refuse to waste the understanding they produced. The relationship ended, and my future did not end with its form. I cannot control the outcome, and my conduct still belongs to me. The double truth prevents meaning from becoming denial. Meaning also changes the experience of the second half of life. Earlier years often organize themselves around expansion, education, work, partnership, family, status, accumulation. Later years can expose the limits of these identities. Roles change, children leave, careers end. Bodies require attention, time becomes less abstract. This can feel like decline if growth has been defined only as acquisition. But another form of growth becomes available. Reduction of false obligation, release of performance, reconciliation with the unlived self, service through experience, a more honest relationship with mortality. A life can become smaller in schedule and larger in meaning. The final years do not need to imitate the first years to remain valuable. Meaning is not a permanent feeling. A person can know why something matters and still feel tired, doubtful, or numb. Meaning does not always energize. Sometimes it simply prevents surrender. You continue because the care matters even when gratitude is absent. You tell the truth because integrity matters even when truth changes nothing immediately. You make the work because expression matters before recognition. You remain present because love matters even when the outcome cannot be repaired. This is one reason meaning is stronger than motivation. Motivation asks whether the action feels rewarding. Meaning asks whether the action remains worthy. Yet meaning can become attached to an identity that no longer fits. A person may know what mattered in one season and still need to become different in the next. The power that allows identity to change without treating the past as wasted is renewal. Power 8. Renewal. Becoming more than what happened. Renewal is not returning to who you were before. The person before the loss did not know the loss. The person before the betrayal did not carry the new knowledge. The person before illness inhabited the body differently. The person before failure trusted different assumptions. To demand a return to the former self can become another form of refusal. Renewal asks a more difficult question. Who can I become now that this has become part of the truth? This does not mean the event was necessary or beneficial. It means time has moved, and the next identity must be built from reality rather than nostalgia. Many people remain loyal to an expired self because the old identity once provided belonging. The dependable one, the strong one, the successful one, the attractive one, the needed one, the peacemaker, the person who never asks, the person who can handle everything. When life removes the conditions supporting that identity, the person may feel that the self has disappeared. But a role is not the whole self. Renewal begins when identity is allowed to become larger than the role it once performed. Imagine a man retiring after decades in a profession that answered every introduction. When people asked who he was, he named the work. The work gave structure, competence, recognition, and social contact. Retirement was expected to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like invisibility. He did not merely lose a schedule, he lost a mirror. At first, he tries to recreate the old authority everywhere. He corrects family members, organizes every detail, and speaks repeatedly about the past. The behavior appears controlling, but beneath it is a question. If I am no longer needed in the old way, do I still exist in a meaningful way? Renewal does not insult the former life. It asks what qualities can be carried into another form. Experience can become mentorship. Precision can become craft. Leadership can become service. Discipline can become care for the body. Knowledge can become teaching without the old title. The identity changes from position to principle. This is one of renewal's deepest movements, separating essence from form. A relationship can end while the capacity for love remains. A career can end while usefulness remains. A body can change while dignity remains. A belief can change while the hunger for truth remains. A dream can fail while the value beneath the dream remains available in another form. The first practice is the inventory of endings. Name what has actually ended. The role, the access, the expectation, the physical capacity, the imagined timeline, the need for a particular person's approval. Then name what has not ended. The value, the skill, the capacity to learn, the right to seek care, the ability to contribute, the possibility of another relationship to meaning. Renewal requires accurate grief. If the ending is not named, the new life becomes a performance built on denied loss. The second practice is the transferable quality. Ask what the old identity was trying to express at its best. Was the career about status, or also about solving problems? Was the relationship about belonging, or also about tenderness? Was physical strength about appearance, or also about vitality and participation? Was the ambition about applause, or also about creation? When the form disappears, the quality may still seek expression. The third practice is the beginner's permission. Renewal often requires incompetence. A new technology, a new social world, a new body routine, a new language for emotion, a new way of relating without rescuing, a new craft entered without reputation. The old identity resists because beginners cannot control how they are seen. Give yourself permission to be unremarkable while learning. The dignity of a beginner is not in appearing capable. It is in remaining teachable. Renewal also requires releasing the fantasy that healing means no longer being affected. A renewed person may still feel grief on anniversaries, may still become activated by a familiar tone, may still miss what they chose to leave, may still require support. The evidence of renewal is not the absence of history. It is the presence of new options. You feel the old fear and ask a new question. You encounter the old trigger and use a new structure. You remember the old wound without giving it every available meaning. You return to the same place as a different participant. This is why renewal is often quiet. From the outside, the circumstances may appear unchanged. Inside, the person is no longer making the same agreement. They stop explaining themselves to someone committed to misunderstanding. They stop using success to earn rest. They stop treating loneliness as a reason to reopen harm. They stop calling care weakness. They stop postponing life until the body, family, money, or past becomes perfect. Renewal is not a dramatic identity announcement. It is a series of discontinued obediences. There is also collective renewal. Families, communities, and institutions repeat patterns because each generation mistakes familiarity for necessity. One person who learns to pause before cruelty, speak honestly about addiction, seek treatment, respect boundaries, or refuse shame can interrupt a pattern older than their own biography. The work may not receive gratitude. Systems often resist the person who stops cooperating with dysfunction. Renewal can feel like betrayal to those who benefited from the former role. This is where courage and discipline return. A new identity requires protection while it is still unfamiliar. Do not announce it too early to people who will use your uncertainty against you. Build evidence through behavior. Let the new self become real in action before demanding that everyone understand. Renewal is not endless self-improvement. The self is not a defective product. Renewal is the living capacity to respond to change without allowing change to erase the whole of who you are. But a renewed life can still become self-absorbed if every power turns inward. The final power asks what recovered authority is for. Power 9. Service. The force that makes a life larger than itself. Private power eventually asks for a public purpose. Not public in the sense of fame. Public in the sense that another life is affected. Attention, interpretation, imagination, pause, courage, discipline, meaning, and renewal can all be used to create a more comfortable ego. A person can become highly self-aware and remain completely self-centered, can protect peace so aggressively that no one can reach them, can call every demand a threat, every sacrifice self-betrayal, and every relationship an interference with personal growth. Service corrects this distortion. It asks, who becomes stronger because I became more conscious? Who becomes safer because I learned to govern anger? Who receives truth because I stopped hiding? What work becomes possible because I disciplined attention? What suffering is reduced because I used experience wisely? A recovered power that serves only the self eventually becomes another form of isolation. Service does not require a grand mission. It can appear in a profession, family, neighborhood, conversation, craft, or quiet act no one records. A nurse who protects a frightened patient's dignity. A father who apologizes and changes the pattern his children would otherwise inherit. A retired worker who teaches skill without humiliating the beginner. A friend who listens without turning another person's pain into advice too quickly. A creator who makes something honest enough to give language to a stranger's experience. A business owner who refuses to build profit on degradation. A person who cares for an ill relative while also accepting help. So care does not become martyrdom. Service makes philosophy measurable. Compassion that never enters conduct remains a preferred self-image. Wisdom that never becomes useful to another person remains private decoration. The contemplative traditions of the world often connect awakening with service for this reason. The contemplative returns from silence. The hero returns from the journey. The elder passes knowledge. The healed person becomes capable of presence. The point is not to remain forever at the mountain, temple, retreat, or moment of insight. The point is to re-enter ordinary life with a different quality of participation. Service must be distinguished from self-erasure. Many people were trained to earn worth by being useful. They anticipate every need, absorb every crisis, remain available without limit, and call exhaustion love. When they attempt to set a boundary, guilt appears because the identity depends upon being needed. This is not service. It is a contract between usefulness and worth. Healthy service gives from relationship with value, not terror of rejection. It can say no. It can rest. It can ask whether help is actually wanted. It can refuse to rescue someone from every consequence. It can protect the body that makes contribution possible. It can allow another person to develop strength rather than keeping them dependent. Service without boundaries creates resentment. Boundaries without service create sterility. The mature life needs both. The first practice is the 1-degree contribution. Do not ask how to save the world. Ask how to leave one person, place, or process 1 degree stronger. Clarify one confusing instruction. Offer 1 hour of focused attention. Share one useful skill. Repair one harm. Protect one vulnerable person from humiliation. Create one piece of work that tells the truth. Make one system more humane. The scale may be small. The direction is larger than the self. The second practice is to give from the healed part, not the bleeding part. A person who has experienced abandonment may rush to become indispensable to everyone. A person who has known poverty may give beyond capacity to prove generosity. A person who is silenced may dominate in the name of teaching. Before serving, ask, am I contributing? Or am I trying to secure identity? Will this leave the other person stronger or more dependent upon me? Can I give this without hidden resentment? Does this action violate a responsibility to my body, family, or truth? Service becomes clean when the giver does not secretly demand that the receiver repair the giver's worth. The third practice is the legacy question. Not, how will I be remembered? Ask, what pattern will continue because I was here? Will people who worked with me become more afraid or more capable? Will my children inherit silence or honest repair? Will my knowledge end with me? Will the rooms I enter contain more dignity because of my conduct? Will the people I love know that love can include truth and boundaries? Legacy is service extended through time. This is especially powerful in later life. The culture often presents age as declining relevance. But experience can become a form of wealth when it is translated rather than guarded. A mature person has seen patterns repeat, has survived mistakes that once felt final, has learned which ambitions were empty and which sacrifices mattered, has witnessed the cost of pride, avoidance, resentment, and unspoken love. This knowledge can become bitterness, or it can become guidance offered without domination. The elder does not need to control the younger life. The elder can offer perspective and allow freedom. Service turns survival into inheritance. It also relieves the exhausting habit of constant self-measurement. Am I successful enough? Healed enough? Visible enough? Advanced enough? When attention enters useful contribution, the self remains present but is no longer the only object in consciousness. This can restore proportion. Some pain becomes lighter when it is no longer required to explain the entire life. Some fear becomes workable when another value needs action. Some loneliness changes when presence becomes an offering rather than a request for rescue. Service does not solve every private wound. It gives recovered power somewhere worthy to go. The 9 powers are now visible. But visibility is not integration. A collection of powers can still create inner conflict unless they learn to sit at the same table. The ordinary trials, where the 9 powers become visible. A power is not real because it sounds convincing in silence. It becomes real at the bank account, the dinner table, the waiting room, the unanswered message, the unfinished work, and the hour when no one is watching. This is where the 9 powers stop being ideas and become an inner government. The first ordinary trial is money. Money gathers many meanings into one symbol. Safety, status, freedom, shame, power, care, possibility, and memory. A number can alter the body before the mind understands why. Attention becomes captured by either constant checking or total avoidance. Interpretation says, this number proves what I am worth. Imagination creates catastrophe or effortless rescue. Impulse wants immediate relief through spending, denial, or a reckless promise. Courage is required to face the facts. Discipline is required to return regularly. Meaning asks what money is meant to support. Renewal allows old financial identities to change. Service asks whether resources are being used in a way that strengthens life rather than image. A centered financial act can be simple. Open the account. Name the amount. Separate the fact from moral worth. Identify one obligation. Identify one leak. Identify one action that increases skill, income, support, or honesty. Do not demand that fear disappear before the numbers are faced. Let fear sit in the room without giving it the calculator. The second ordinary trial is relationship. Relationships activate the deepest powers because they involve attachment, memory, approval, rejection, belonging, and vulnerability. A delayed reply receives attention. Interpretation calls it abandonment. Imagination builds a future in which love has ended. Impulse sends another message. The pause disappears. Courage becomes confused with confrontation. Discipline abandons the boundary because loneliness has returned. Meaning becomes dependent upon one person's access. Renewal is postponed because the old relationship remains emotionally available. Service becomes rescuing. The 9 powers can reorganize the scene. Attention returns to what actually occurred. Interpretation separates delay from verdict. Imagination rehearses a dignified response rather than catastrophe. Pause prevents discharge. Courage asks directly where directness is appropriate. Discipline protects the standard already chosen. Meaning remembers that love is a value larger than one outcome. Renewal allows the relationship to change form or end. Service refuses both cruelty and self-erasure. A relationship becomes healthier when neither person is required to regulate the entire inner world of the other. The third ordinary trial is the body. The body is often treated as a machine to dominate, an image to judge, or an oracle whose every sensation must be obeyed. Each extreme removes discernment. Attention may ignore the body until pain becomes impossible to dismiss. Interpretation may call every symptom failure, punishment, or catastrophe. Imagination may create illness from uncertainty or deny illness through spiritual fantasy. Impulse may search endlessly, self-diagnose, overtrain, stop treatment, or avoid care. Courage may be required to seek qualified help. Discipline may appear as medicine, sleep, food, movement, rehabilitation, or limits. Meaning prevents reduced capacity from becoming reduced human worth. Renewal creates another relationship with the changing body. Service includes accepting care so that love can move in both directions. The body is not outside spiritual life. It is where many spiritual claims are tested. Can you honor limitation without building identity from it? Can you seek medical or psychological care without interpreting help as weakness? Can you stop using high ideals to punish ordinary human needs? Can you remain more than appearance while still practicing responsible care? A mature inner authority listens to the body without turning every sensation into prophecy. The fourth ordinary trial is work. Work exposes the difference between inspiration and discipline. At the beginning, a vision contains emotional electricity. Later, the task becomes repetitive. The audience may be absent. The result may not arrive. This is where imagination, courage, and discipline either cooperate or divide. Attention must be protected. Interpretation must stop calling silence failure. Imagination must see the work completed without demanding guaranteed recognition. Pause must interrupt comparison and panic. Courage must release imperfect work into reality. Discipline must return after ordinary days. Meaning must answer why the work matters before applause. Renewal must revise the method when feedback reveals weakness. Service must keep the work connected to a real human need. The person who creates only for recognition becomes controlled by evidence. The person who refuses all evidence becomes controlled by fantasy. Inner authority holds vision and feedback together. This method is not working yet. The value may still be true. The form can change. The direction can remain. The fifth ordinary trial is waiting. A result has not arrived. A person has not answered. The body has not improved at the hoped-for speed. The application remains undecided. The opportunity remains invisible. Waiting exposes how strongly the mind wants relief from uncertainty. Attention checks. Interpretation creates a verdict. Imagination rehearses disappointment. Impulse forces an answer. Courage is confused with impatience. Discipline abandons preparation. Meaning collapses into timing. Renewal becomes impossible because the mind refuses any path except the expected one. Service is forgotten because the self is occupied entirely by outcome. The centered person does not romanticize waiting. Some situations require follow-up, negotiation, another route, or an ending. But they refuse to make a permanent decision solely to escape the discomfort of not knowing. During waiting, ask, what remains under my influence? What preparation is still useful? What feedback have I avoided? What other route deserves examination? What part of life is being neglected while I stare at this one closed door? The sixth ordinary trial is success. Success appears desirable, but it can outsource power as quickly as failure. Attention becomes addicted to praise. Interpretation calls visibility proof of superiority. Imagination assumes the height will continue. Impulse expands too quickly. Pause disappears because confidence feels like omniscience. Courage becomes contempt for caution. Discipline is abandoned because the person believes that they have arrived. Meaning becomes reputation. Renewal is resisted because the successful identity must be protected. Service becomes performance. The 9 powers keep success proportionate. Receive praise without building a home inside it. Enjoy increase without treating it as permanent. Expand structure before expanding promise. Remember the people and practices that existed before visibility. Use power to increase responsibility, not exemption. Success reveals character because it removes some external restraints. The question becomes not only what you can do, but what you will refuse to become. The final ordinary trial is the second half of life. Time becomes visible in another way. The body carries history. Choices have consequences. Some doors are no longer available in their former shape. The mind can interpret this as evidence that the most meaningful life is behind you. But the powers do not belong to youth. Attention can still be reclaimed. Interpretation can still change. Imagination can still reveal a future proportionate to reality and alive with meaning. Pause can interrupt patterns practiced for decades. Courage can begin at any age. Discipline can protect what remains. Meaning can deepen when performance becomes less persuasive. Renewal can turn experience into another form. Service can make the later years larger than personal ambition ever did. A person does not need unlimited time to make a decisive change in direction. They need enough time for one honest act to become another. These trials reveal why the powers cannot operate alone. Money requires attention and meaning. Relationships require pause and courage. The body requires interpretation and discipline. Work requires imagination and service. Waiting requires renewal. Success requires every power to remain accountable. The question is no longer whether you possess 9 abilities. The question is whether they can cooperate when life becomes ordinary. The inner council, how the powers govern together. Imagine a long table inside consciousness. At this table sit 9 powers. each with a different responsibility. Attention decides what enters the room. Interpretation explains what it means. Imagination shows what may follow. Pause controls when action begins. Courage determines what fear will not prevent. Discipline protects direction through time. Meaning remembers why the direction matters. Renewal changes the form when reality changes. Service asks who else is affected by the decision. A well-governed life does not silence any of these voices. It prevents any single voice from ruling alone. When attention rules alone, the person may become obsessed with whatever is most vivid. When interpretation rules alone, everything becomes analysis and no action begins. When imagination rules alone, possibility becomes fantasy or fear. When pause rules alone, reflection becomes delay. When courage rules alone, boldness becomes recklessness. When discipline rules alone, life becomes rigid. When meaning rules alone, every event is forced into a lesson. When renewal rules alone, commitment disappears into constant reinvention. When service rules alone, the self is abandoned in the name of usefulness. Inner authority is not the victory of one power. It is coordination. Consider a decision to leave a harmful work environment. Attention gathers the facts without consuming outrage all day. Interpretation distinguishes difficulty from degradation and fear from evidence. Imagination rehearses possible futures, including transition and recovery. Pause prevents resignation in emotional emergency. Courage acknowledges that staying has a cost. Discipline builds savings, skill, applications, and a timeline. Meaning identifies the values being protected. Renewal allows the professional identity to change. Service considers responsibilities to family, colleagues, and those affected by the departure. No single power solves the decision. Together, they create proportion. Consider a decision to remain and repair a relationship. Attention notices both harm and evidence of genuine change. Interpretation refuses to call one apology transformation or one mistake the entire person. Imagination sees what repair would require in behavior. Pause reduces reaction. Courage speaks truth and hears truth. Discipline maintains boundaries and repeated practice. Meaning remembers why the relationship matters. Renewal allows the old form to die so a different relationship can emerge. Service asks whether both lives become more honest and capable. The counsel also reveals false substitutes for power. Control can imitate attention by monitoring everything. Certainty can imitate interpretation by eliminating complexity. Fantasy can imitate imagination by refusing feedback. Avoidance can imitate pause by never returning to action. Aggression can imitate courage by hiding fear beneath force. Punishment can imitate discipline by using shame as fuel. Spiritual explanation can imitate meaning by assigning purpose before grief is heard. Rebranding can imitate renewal while the behavior remains unchanged. Martyrdom can imitate service while resentment grows underneath. The difference is discovered through consequence. Does the power increase truth? Does it increase capacity? Does it create cleaner action? Does it respect reality? Does it preserve dignity without denying responsibility? Does it make the life more available to love, work, care, and contribution? A false power produces intensity without integration. A real power produces increasing coherence. Coherence means the words, values, structures, and actions begin to belong to the same life. You stop saying peace matters while feeding conflict all day. Stop saying health matters while treating care as optional. Stop saying the work matters while allowing every interruption to enter first. Stop saying a boundary is final while leaving the door open for loneliness. Stop saying service matters while using people to confirm worth. This alignment is not perfection. Contradictions remain visible. The difference is that contradiction becomes instruction rather than permanent hypocrisy. The council can be called during any difficult moment through 9 questions. What is receiving my attention? What meaning am I assigning? What future am I rehearsing? What needs to wait? What honest action requires courage? What structure would preserve direction? Why does this matter? What form may need to change? Who becomes stronger or weaker through my choice? You will not always answer all 9. Sometimes one question reveals the entire problem. A person obsessing over a message may need attention. A person collapsed by rejection may need interpretation. A person paralyzed by imagined catastrophe may need imagination. A person about to react may need pause. A person waiting for confidence may need courage. A person repeatedly beginning may need discipline. A person enduring without purpose may need meaning. A person loyal to an expired role may need renewal. A person trapped inside self-concern may need service. This is how inner government becomes practical. You do not use every instrument at maximum volume. You identify which power has been absent, distorted, or overruled. The council also needs a chair. What holds the powers together? Awareness. Awareness is not listed as a separate power here because it is the room in which all 9 become visible. Without awareness, attention is captured. Interpretation is mistaken for fact. Imagination becomes prophecy. Pause disappears. Courage becomes impulse. Discipline becomes habit without examination. Meaning becomes inherited. Renewal becomes reaction. And service becomes performance. Awareness does not make every decision easy. It makes the decision conscious enough to become yours. This is the deepest meaning of inner authority. Not that no one influences you. Not that advice is rejected. Not that every decision is independent. Human beings need teachers, physicians, therapists, families, communities, laws, traditions, and honest feedback. Inner authority is not isolation from influence. It is the capacity to receive influence without surrendering responsibility for what you authorize. You can listen deeply and still decide. You can change your mind and remain whole. You can accept correction without handing another person your entire identity. You can require help without becoming powerless. You can belong without disappearing. The counsel becomes strong through practice, not through one emotional revelation. The next section gives it a daily form. The daily return, a practice for reclaiming inner authority. A teaching becomes part of life when it has a place to return. Without practice, the 9 powers remain memorable ideas. They may inspire a night and disappear into the next morning's noise. The daily return is not a ritual of perfection. It is a brief meeting with the inner council before habit, urgency, and other people's expectations decide the day. The full practice can be completed in several quiet minutes. On difficult days, use only the question that matters most. Begin with arrival. Before messages, news, or demands, notice the condition in which you woke. Heavy, restless, clear, grieving, hopeful, afraid. Do not correct the state immediately. Say, this is the condition present. It is not yet the meaning of the day. Then call the first power. Attention. What deserves the first clear part of my mind today? Choose one person, task, value, or need. Not 10. Attention becomes trustworthy through specificity. Call interpretation. What event am I already explaining before the day has begun? Perhaps yesterday's silence has become rejection. Perhaps one mistake has become a verdict. Replace the total story with an exact sentence. Call imagination. What am I rehearsing? If fear is staging catastrophe, rehearse one honorable response. See yourself acting with the quality you want available. Call pause. Where am I most likely to react today? Create one delay before the trigger arrives. Call courage. What honest action have I been waiting to feel ready for? Choose the next proportionate step. Call discipline. What appointment will protect the direction? Name the time, place, and minimum faithful act. Call meaning. Why does this matter beyond mood, praise, or immediate result? Call renewal. What old form am I trying to preserve after life has already changed? Name one new form worth testing. Call service. Who can be left 1 degree stronger through my presence today? Do not promise the whole world. Choose one contribution, then create a single sentence of authority. Today, fear may speak, but it will not schedule my entire life. Today, I will face the number without turning it into worth. Today, I will protect the work before entering comparison. Today, I will not reopen harm because loneliness becomes loud. Today, I will ask for help before exhaustion becomes collapse. Today, I will let the body set a proportion without letting shame name the day. The sentence is not an affirmation that reality must obey. It is a decision about participation. During the day, use the return sequence when activation rises. Notice, name, separate, choose. Notice the body and state. Name the story and impulse. Separate fact from interpretation. Choose the next honorable action or delay. This sequence can take 1 minute. At night, review without prosecution. Where did attention go? What interpretation gained authority? What future did imagination rehearse? Where did a pause appear? What courageous act occurred, even if small? What promise was kept? Where did meaning remain? What old form loosened? Who received something useful because you were present? Then ask what requires repair. An apology, a corrected message, a changed environment, a smaller commitment, a clearer boundary, an appointment, rest. The review is not a trial of worth. It is training for earlier recognition. Once a week, examine the larger pattern. Which power has been overused? Perhaps discipline has become rigidity. Perhaps service has become self-neglect. Perhaps imagination has become endless planning. Perhaps pause has become avoidance. Which power has been absent? Perhaps courage is waiting behind preparation. Perhaps meaning has been replaced by productivity. Perhaps renewal is needed because the current structure belongs to an earlier life. Then make one environmental change. Remove the easy access. Schedule the conversation. Place the medicine where it will be remembered. Protect the hour. Ask someone for accountability. Reduce the media that feeds the feared state. Write the reason the boundary exists. Prepare for the next return while you can see clearly. There will be days when this practice feels alive. There will be days when it feels mechanical. Do not measure its truth only by emotion. A compass remains useful when the traveler feels nothing toward north. The practice is not intended to make you self-sufficient. Some conditions exceed what private reflection can hold. Seek qualified medical, psychological, legal, financial, or community support when it is needed. Inner authority includes recognizing the limits of solitary effort. The strong person is not the person who never needs help. It is the person who can receive help without surrendering responsibility, dignity, or discernment. The daily return will not prevent every reaction. You will still send a message too quickly. Still abandon a task. Still believe a fearful interpretation. Still seek approval. Still confuse service with rescue. When this happens, do not turn the teaching into another weapon. Return after the mistake. Return after the week of avoidance. Return after success makes you careless. Return after grief removes the desire to practice. Return without demanding that the previous failure disappear first. The power is not proven by never leaving the center. It is proven by learning the way back. Before we enter the final movement, subscribe if you intend to continue studying the hidden laws of attention, identity, meaning, and conscious action. Keep this work near, not as another moment of inspiration, but as a structure you can return to when the world becomes loud. The final question remains: what changes when these powers are reclaimed, but the world still does not give you the outcome you wanted? The final authority: you were never powerless. The world may not change immediately when you reclaim attention. The person may still misunderstand you. The application may still be rejected. The body may still require treatment. The money may still be insufficient. The relationship may still end. The work may remain unseen. The past may still contain consequences. If power is measured only by external obedience, you will feel powerful only when circumstance agrees. That is not authority. It is dependence with favorable conditions. The 9 powers offer something more durable. Attention allows you to decide what will receive life even when the world is loud. Interpretation allows pain to remain real without becoming the only explanation of who you are. Imagination allows you to rehearse an honorable future without demanding certainty. Pause prevents temporary intensity from creating permanent consequence. Courage allows values to move while fear is still present. Discipline protects what matters after motivation has left. Meaning prevents suffering from becoming empty authority. Renewal allows identity to change without declaring the past worthless. Service gives recovered power a purpose larger than self-protection. This is not omnipotence. It is participation without self-abandonment. At the beginning, you were asked where you had surrendered authorship. Return to that area now. The opinion that determines your worth. The fear that delays the work. The urgency that controls money. The loneliness that reopens harm. The role that no longer fits. The pain that has been asked to explain the entire future. The approval you keep pursuing from someone unable or unwilling to give it. The age you have interpreted as an ending. The service that has become self-erasure. What would reclaiming authority look like there? Not emotionally, behaviorally. Perhaps attention stops returning to the old message. Interpretation stops calling distance proof of unworthiness. Imagination sees a future not organized around being chosen by that person. Pause protects the next vulnerable night. Courage keeps the boundary. Discipline removes easy access. Meaning remembers what the boundary protects. Renewal allows another identity to form. Service redirects love toward relationships where it can become mutual and alive. The outer event may not change. The entire structure of participation does. This is how a life changes without magical blame. A repeated thought becomes a state. A state influences perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior shapes relationship, persistence, and consequence. The chain does not control every event. It affects enough of lived reality to matter profoundly. The person who reclaims power does not become invulnerable. They become less available to unconscious command. Fear still arrives, but it must present evidence. Anger still arrives, but it must become precise before acting. Shame still arrives, but it cannot define the whole self. Excitement still arrives, but it must build structure before making promises. Grief still arrives, but it is not required to close every future. Praise still arrives, but it cannot purchase identity. Criticism still arrives, but it does not automatically receive jurisdiction. This is the quiet revolution of inner authority. It does not look dramatic from the outside. A message remains unanswered until morning. A person opens the account. A truth is spoken without cruelty. A body receives care. A task is completed without inspiration. A later life begins without permission from comparison. A family pattern ends because one person learns to pause. A skill is passed on. A boundary remains. A mistake becomes repair instead of identity. These actions are small enough to be missed and strong enough to alter generations. You were not born with unlimited control. No human being was. You were born with capacities for attention, interpretation, imagination, pause, courage, discipline, meaning, renewal, and service. These capacities can be weakened, trained, distorted, supported, neglected, or reclaimed. The tragedy is not that you ever lost perfect power. The tragedy is that you may have mistaken influence for authority and habit for identity. You may have believed that because fear was loud, it was wise. Because approval felt necessary, it was deserved authority. Because a pattern was old, it was permanent. Because motivation disappeared, the direction was false. Because the world did not respond immediately, your inner work had no value. Because time passed, meaning had passed with it. None of these conclusions is final. A human life remains capable of reorganization as long as awareness can meet one decision differently. You do not need to reclaim all 9 powers tonight. Choose the one your life is asking for now. Attention, if your mind belongs to every interruption. Interpretation, if one event has become the whole story. Imagination, if fear has been rehearsing the future. Pause, if urgency keeps creating consequence. Courage, if certainty has become the price of action. Discipline, if motivation repeatedly abandons what matters. Meaning, if pain has emptied the path. Renewal, if an expired identity still governs. Service, if the inner journey has become too small and self-contained. Call that power by name. Give it one visible form. Protect it with structure. Practice it before emotion agrees. Return when you forget. There is no final state in which the world can no longer disturb you. There is no permanent height from which all uncertainty disappears. The strongest traditions never promised such a life. They offered a way to remain human without becoming unconscious. You may still tremble, still grieve, still doubt, still need help, still change your mind, still discover that the old pattern acted before awareness arrived. Power is not the elimination of these experiences. Power is the recovery of participation within them. The world will continue asking for your attention. Fear will continue offering interpretations. Anxiety will continue using imagination. Urgency will continue trying to erase the pause. Comfort will continue negotiating with courage. Mood will continue voting against discipline. Pain will continue trying to become the only meaning. The past will continue presenting itself as identity. Ego will continue turning service into recognition. Let them speak. They are voices, not rulers. The council is yours to call. The chair is yours to occupy. The next action is yours to authorize. You were never powerless. You were interrupted. You were frightened. You were trained to look outward before looking within. You were rewarded for performance and discouraged from trust. You learned to confuse speed with intelligence, approval with worth, comfort with safety, and repetition with destiny. but the powers remained. Waiting in the moment, attention returns. Waiting in the second interpretation. Waiting in the future, rehearsed with dignity. Waiting in the breath before reaction. Waiting in the act, performed while fear watches. Waiting in the promise, kept without applause. Waiting in the meaning, built after explanation, fails. Waiting in the self that can change form. Waiting in the contribution that makes a private life larger. The recovery begins quietly, not tomorrow, not when certainty arrives, not when the world becomes easier. In the next decision that once belonged to fear and now receives your conscious participation. Stand there, choose there, return there, again and again, until the powers you stopped trusting become the life you are finally willing to live.